Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of True Crime Guru. I'm Brock Scales. If you've already watched my first 3 episodes that dropped last week, then welcome back. If you haven't, I highly suggest you go give them a watch because they are important cases that deserve coverage. And that is my goal and purpose of this channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about the disappearance of 17-year-old Macin Smith from St. George, Utah on September 1st, 2015. Unfortunately, Macin is still missing today, and the more people that know his story, the more likely that he will be found and his family will receive the resolution that they need. Macin Smith was born on April 7th, 1998 to Tracey and Darrin Smith. He was the youngest of 6 children and was a total mama's boy. Macin was born with a condition that affected his speech called speech aphasia, which essentially just causes a person to speak unusually. For example, mixing up words or mumbling in a way to where sentences don't make sense. Macin was able to receive speech therapy to correct this, but was still left with a slight speech impediment that is described as being slurred. For most of Macin's life, the Smiths resided in Alberta, Canada. Macin is described as being extremely introverted and shy with crippling social anxiety, which I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. Unfortunately, Macin was bullied a lot growing up because of his speech, and this led to him having struggles with depression in his teen years. In fact, both Macin and Tracey found themselves struggling with depression while in Canada, and decided they needed a change. In April of 2015, when Macin was a junior in high school going on to be a senior in the fall, Tracey decided to move from Alberta to St. George, Utah, so that they could have a change of scenery and be in a close-knit community that aligned with their Mormon faith. According to Tracey, Macin was settling into Utah very well and enjoyed that people were so much nicer there. Although he was still shy, Macin had dreams and aspirations of becoming a performer. Tracey said that he enjoyed writing songs and singing. Like most teenagers, Macin enjoyed spending time playing video games online. Most of his time spent online was specifically watching anime. Tracey said that he was obsessed with anime and would spend hours watching. Macin Smith seemed like your everyday normal teenager. But like most young people these days, there was a darkness looming within Macin that may have led to his disappearance. The story of Macin's disappearance begins on August 31st, 2015. He texted his mom that day to let her know that his grades so far for the year were nearly all A's. This excited Macin because he had made a deal with Tracey that as long as he kept his grades up, he was allowed to watch anime on school nights. So Macin was planning on going home that day to reap in his reward by watching anime. However, his father, Darrin, had other plans. He wanted to take Macin out to practice driving. Unlike most teenage boys, Macin had absolutely no interest in driving, and that may be because of the anxiety he was experiencing. I've known a lot of people who have either delayed driving or don't drive at all because of their anxiety. Despite Macin's disinterest, Darrin wanted to push Macin to drive because he wanted Macin to take on more responsibility, such as getting a job. But Macin was not interested and told his dad that he wasn't feeling well, presumably so that he could get out of it. Tracey arrives home that night around 8:30 p.m. and decides to check on Macin in his room. She describes the room as being dark and Macin being in his bed. The Smiths enforced a strict no electronics after 10 p.m. policy. So, as usual, Tracey went to disconnect the internet cord before going to bed. She says that usually she would hide the cord so that Macin couldn't just simply plug it back in. But she was too tired that night and didn't feel like hiding it. At some point throughout the night, Darrin is awoken by some noise and takes a guess that it must be Macin disobeying the rules and being on his computer. His suspicions are confirmed when he finds Macin watching anime after hours. He demands Macin's phone and laptop from him, and Macin does so with no argument. After that, they just simply go back to bed. The next morning, Darrin says that he hears Macin getting ready for school between 7 and 7:40 a.m. As usual, so there's nothing abnormal there. Darrin and Tracey then proceed to go on with their day. Darrin says that he went to the gym early that afternoon and spent the rest of the afternoon doing things outside of the house. He was looking forward to Macin coming home that day because he was going to take Macin driving since they didn't get to the day before. Around 3 p.m., Darrin starts growing concerned when Macin hadn't arrived home yet. He gets in contact with Tracey, and they both decide not to get too worried right away, since Macin might just be blowing off steam after his punishment from the night before. But then Tracey goes to check her email, and she sees an email from Macin's school notifying her that he did not attend classes that day. Immediately, Tracey decides to leave work and go home, because clearly something is wrong. When she gets home, her and Darrin decide to check Macin's room, and they notice that the door is locked, which is super unusual. Tracey says that Macin's door is never locked. They are able to get into the room, and when they get inside, they notice that everything looks as it should be. Nothing was out of place, there were no clothes missing, or anything. And it's not as if they can call Macin, since they confiscated his phone the night before. Tracey then decides to call their church, because sometimes Macin would attend youth group in the evening, but no luck there either. That's when Darrin and Tracey decide to report Macin missing. The Smiths and police had presumed that Macin had just run away. Now, I know that this is not what you would usually hear from family when a loved one turns up missing, but Macin had actually had a history of running away. Just 2 years earlier, in December of 2013, Macin had attempted to run away under pretty similar circumstances. He had had his Xbox confiscated and tried to run away. But he did end up returning on his own volition due to it being December in Canada. The next day, when Macin did not show up for school, Tracey began to become more worried. She actually ended up verifying with the bus driver that Macin didn't even get on the bus that day. So she decides to take another look at Macin's room. This time, she finds his backpack hidden in the closet. His wallet with his ID and cash were left behind as well. It appeared that wherever Macin had gone, he had absolutely nothing with him. A lead does quickly emerge, though. Several people reported seeing a young man holding a sign near an exit ramp for Interstate 15, saying that he needed a ride to Las Vegas. And then a separate report comes in saying that someone fitting Macin's description was actually in Vegas. This seemed like a super credible lead, so Darrin wasted no time getting in the car and making the roughly 2-hour drive to Vegas. He is actually met with the help of a Las Vegas search team known as Red Rock Search and Rescue. They begin scouring the streets of Vegas looking for Macin. But thousands of people are in Las Vegas every day, and many people are reported missing every day from Las Vegas alone. So unfortunately, there was no luck in locating Macin there. The police decide to take a different approach in trying to search for Macin through his digital footprint. But for a teenager, there actually wasn't much there. No real activity on social media, and they found no search history about disappearing or going off the grid. Surveillance actually also came back from that I-15 exit, and it was confirmed that the hitchhiker was not Macin. But I don't know how much I believe that. It just seems like too much of a coincidence for me. I mean, how many young men go missing from St. George, Utah on a daily basis? It started to seem like Macin had just disappeared out of thin air. The initial leads were running dry, until about 6 days later when Tracey discovered a note hidden in Macin's wallet. It was a 2-page note that has never been fully released because of its personal nature, but Tracey did say it included the words, "I'm done." Now there's a few things about this note that don't make sense to me. Let's say this is a suicide note. Usually someone leaving a suicide note would leave it to where someone could easily find it, not concealed in a wallet to where it may not be found for quite some time, if at all. Also, if this was such a long note, how did it fit folded up so tightly in a wallet without bulging out? I'm not saying that this is impossible, but it certainly seems strange to me. A new lead comes in when a neighbor reports that she saw Macin around 3 p.m. on September 1st, walking away from his home towards the desert. To give you a little bit more context, the St. George area is in close proximity to the Red Cliffs National Conservation, and behind the subdivision where Macin lived was essentially nothing but desert and particularly high cliff areas. The Red Rock Search and Rescue actually did a major search in the desert. It was a very widespread search, but unfortunately it did not help find Macin. At this point, the Smiths start to become very concerned that they will never find their son. Even though Darrin was not a part of the LDS Church, the rest of the family is. And the Mormon community rallied around them, assisting in searches and helping spread awareness. Tracey did start the Help Find Macin Smith Facebook page, which now serves as an awareness page for all missing people. But for the Smiths, the question of what happened to Macin still lingers. The day that everyone was longing for was Macin's 18th birthday. They theorized that maybe Macin had just ran away because he didn't like the strict rules that the Smiths had placed before him, and that when he legally became an adult, he would return. But that day comes and goes, and still no sign of Macin. A couple of teenage girls reported that they were approached by a male matching Macin's description at a Panda Express asking for bus fare. They even reported that there was something unusual about the guy's speech. When they told their mom, she immediately thought of the Macin Smith story and thought it might be him. Unfortunately, the Panda Express said that their surveillance footage was not working that day, so there's no way to know for sure. But somehow the police say the Panda Express sighting was ruled out, but they've never said how. For me, I don't see how they could rule it out completely without the surveillance footage. Tracey said that Macin had always dreamed of living in California, and there have been a few sightings in California over the years. Specifically in 2017, Macin was sighted living amongst the homeless population in Modesto. I feel like that is pretty creditable because statistically, if Macin had run away, he would be living amongst many of the homeless youth that we unfortunately continue to see rise each year. I think one of the biggest theories in Macin's case is that he committed suicide, and I think that is largely because of the heartbreaking letter that was left behind. But like I said before, it didn't really scream suicide note for me just because of the location. Now, of course, nobody knows the full contents of this letter except the Smiths and probably police, so we don't know everything that was said, but it definitely seems like it had an ominous tone. Macin had actually attempted suicide before in Canada and was hospitalized for a short period of time for his depression. When I think about the day that Macin went missing, there is one thing I can think of that would support this theory. His parents took away his phone and laptop. Now, to any teenager, that feels like the end of the world. But for someone as shy and introverted as Macin, that was his only coping mechanism. So when you think in the mind of a teenager, add the history of depression and anxiety on top of that, something like this could be a breaking point for someone like Macin. And I am in no way blaming the Smiths. They were just doing their jobs as parents by disciplining their child. I'm just thinking in the mind of an adolescent and in a way that would support the theory that Macin may have committed suicide. The only question with this theory is how. The Smiths had no weapons in the house and no prescription drugs or anything like that. Some people did theorize that Macin may have gone and jumped off of one of those cliffs nearby, but even with that, I feel like his remains would have been recovered by now. As in all missing persons cases, there is the possibility that Macin left to start a new life. But unlike many missing person cases, I feel like that is a real possibility here. When you think back to the hitchhiker, I think there is a great possibility that that was Macin. However, I have not seen the surveillance footage that confirmed it wasn't. I also feel like it's possible that that Panda Express sighting was also Macin. Give that with the sightings in California living with the homeless, just paints a pretty good picture of your typical teenage runaway. There's a lot of online speculation that Macin may have left because he was gay, and that the Smiths would express a great deal of disdain towards that. And I'm not saying that that's not a possibility, because it could very well be. And I, of course, do not know what the Smith family dynamic is like, but Tracey says it would not have been a problem. I personally feel like this is extremely speculative and puts a lot of baseless blame on the Smiths. Macin was clearly struggling with a lot of things, and his sexuality could have been one of them. But I don't think that gives the Smiths any less right to know where their child is. Another theory that has been put out there online is that the Smiths had something to do with Macin's disappearance, specifically Darrin. I do not think that this is likely at all, but I think the reason it was initially put out there was because Darrin was said to have not been talking to the media and keeping pretty quiet about Macin's disappearance. I get where people are coming from with that, but when it comes to child disappearances, I feel like the media tends to focus more on the mom because it makes a more compelling story. There are some suspicious things that support this theory, though, and even though I don't personally think that this is what happened to Macin, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you guys. So the day that Macin disappeared, remember Darrin said he heard Macin getting ready at around 7 to 7:40 in the morning and was in bed. He also said that he went to the gym early that afternoon. Well, his gym card showed that he swiped at 7:45 a.m. on September 1st, 2015, which means that he couldn't have heard Macin getting ready and lied about what time he went to the gym. Now, this could have been a common mix-up, or it could have not been. Police actually even put a GPS tracker on Darrin's truck for 60 days to see if it would yield anything suspicious, but it ultimately did not. Police also say that Darrin and Tracey have told them inconsistent stories, and have told inconsistent stories to the Red Rock Search and Rescue team. Police also say that Darrin and Tracey have never called for updates on Macin's case. Now, they have both been polygraphed by police, but the results are unknown. I really don't think that the Smiths had anything to do with it, but with Macin still never being found, it is always a possibility. At the end of it all, Macin Smith is still missing today, and those who are left behind deserve to know what happened to him. Did he commit suicide and for whatever reason his remains haven't been discovered? If his note was a suicide note, did he go through great lengths to conceal it because maybe he didn't want his body to be found either? Or maybe he left to start a new life, but only ended up living amongst the many homeless youth that we see in this country every day. Or the opposite, he left to start a new life and did just that, and is living somewhere perfectly happy and safe. I personally believe that Macin either committed suicide, or is living somewhere either homeless or alive and well. But there is always the chance that something more sinister happened to Macin. Perhaps at the hands of his parents, or even more likely, the hands of a stranger. The Smiths continue to hold out hope that one day they will find Macin, and they continue to advocate for missing people all across the country. At the time of his disappearance, Macin Smith was 17 years old, had light blue eyes and short blonde hair. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall at about 200 pounds. If you have any information about the disappearance of Macin Smith, please call the St. George Police Department at 435-627-4300. If you are experiencing thoughts and feelings of suicide or self-harm, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Your life matters. Thank you everyone for watching. I kindly ask that you please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and please subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all the content I have to provide. Tune in next week when I tell the story of Missy Beavers, a young mom and fitness instructor that was murdered in the wee hours of the morning at her local church before her class. Please watch as I explore the twists and turns of this mysterious, unsolved case.